Good
And
evening and welcome to your post-election coverage. I'm Angela Peterson,
I'm Stephen Alexander.
and we're here with Dr. David Kanervo. How are you this evening?
I'm fine. Thank you so very much for inviting me back to APSU-TV. I'm a retired faculty member from Austin Peay, and I predated both of you, I'm sure. I retired just a few years ago and taught there for 36 years in the Department of Political Science.
Awesome. We're so happy to have you here. So we're just
Thank you
going to
very
jump.
much.
Yeah, no problem. We're just going to jump right into it. So on Saturday, it was announced that Joe Biden was the president-elect of the 2020 election. However, President Trump and his administration still refused to concede the election. Mike Pompeo even came out with a statement today saying that he's ready for a smooth second term for President Trump. Do you think that him, as well as his administration, may be in denial?
Well, I think so. I think there are a couple possible interpretations to what's going on. One may very well be that Trump is in denial and that he um, is thinking about refusing to leave office. And as horrible as that sounds, it is not too untypical from what he's been doing the last 4 years, it seems to me. I have been concerned myself about some of his, what I consider anti-democratic statements and activities. When I say anti-democratic, I mean small d, not Democratic Party, but actions in which he has really kind of cozied up to what I'd call authoritarianism. He seems to hold Vladimir Putin as someone who he admires. He has really not seemed particularly concerned about following the will of the people and concerned about voters and their rights. He has not, for example, been at all sympathetic to the mail-in voters and what they're going through in their fear of COVID. And so that's a real concern for me. And I hope that that's one interpretation which is not going to come to fruition. I think a separate interpretation might be that since Trump did not win by the popular vote last time, and perhaps doesn't respect the popular vote all that much, that he's waiting until the popular votes are certified and that the Electoral College has met in December. And that once they have met and certify that, in fact, Joe Biden is the winner in the Electoral College, that perhaps then Trump will give in and concede, or he might even wait until January, when under the Constitution, the joint session of Congress gathers to count the electoral votes in an official meeting that happens right around January 6th or so. And it might be that once those are certified by Congress, that then maybe he'll concede. But it's hard to tell what he's thinking right now. And I hope it's the latter case rather than the former in regard to how he's thinking about this right now.
Right. I know a lot of people right now, specifically the Republican Party, are talking about voter fraud. That's why these lawsuits have come about. How prevalent is voter fraud actually in the United States?
Well, it's not prevalent at all. There may be some individual cases where people have cheated. Interestingly enough, the case I heard about for this election was coming from Pennsylvania and involved a Republican voter, not a Democratic one, in which apparently a Republican voter tried to get an absentee ballot for his deceased mother. And he was found out, of course, because the election commission in his community put his request against the obituary rolls and discovered what he was trying to do. So it's those kinds of individual little cases that happen rather than any kind of major coordinated attack on the election system by masses of people. That is the kind of thing that normally happens.
Do you think that
And I'm sorry, but and generally those, as a result, of course, have very little impact on the overall election outcome.
so that goes with the next question I was going to ask. So overall, you don't think that the lawsuits that Trump has put out will ultimately change the outcome of the election?
No, probably not. Generally, when there are voter recounts, normally the recounts may lead to 100 or 200 votes changing because of misreading of earlier ballots or earlier counts, or a math issue that occurred when someone was adding up the votes. But I think the fact that Trump's people don't have any real evidence, it seems to me, of any kind of massive vote fraud, I just don't see how they're going to be successful in their challenges.
So we're going to move on to the next subject. I know that in 2016, Fox News, in regards to Hillary Clinton, said that you have to know when you've lost and when it's time to concede. Do you feel that they are taking their own advice with Trump currently?
Well, yeah, I don't think Trump has in fact acknowledged that he has lost in his own mind, and while many of his supporters do, I think many of the people around him do. In fact, according to news reports, even his wife Melania has been willing to acknowledge that he has lost. But he's the one who seems to call all the shots. And so he, in his own mind, is not willing to acknowledge it yet and is not willing to concede. And that's a real problem. It's a problem for the country. It's a problem for our relationships overseas. It's a problem for getting funding in the transition period to the Biden folks so that they can get paid, have office space, and do all the normal things that are required as part of the transition. It's really very unfair to the Biden folks for this to be happening.
I agree. And you've been a political science professor for a very long time. Have you ever seen an election like this?
No, the closest I think that I can recall was 2000 with the infamous Chad voting process, in which they used punch cards, and not everyone punched their card completely with their stylus. And so some of you're probably familiar with the way punch cards work. Sometimes the little cardboard holes are not completely free, so that the little dots that are supposed to come out continue to hang on in one little area and don't fall away. And that was the problem in 2000. And so it was not always clear whether someone had intended to vote for Gore or had intended to vote for Bush. And they were holding the votes up to the light and trying to see whether they were completed enough votes. Well, the point is that once the Supreme Court got involved and made a decision, Gore pretty quickly conceded, and they went on. And while Gore, I think, was certainly right to challenge the outcome and challenge the voting, which he had every right to do, he did concede pretty quickly once the handwriting was on the wall.
Yes, these are definitely unique circumstances, especially with coronavirus. Speaking of coronavirus, President-elect Biden said in a speech on Monday that he plans to get coronavirus under control. In fact, he said that that's his #1 priority. One of his goals is to issue a nationwide mask mandate. We've all seen how this has went with statewide mask mandates, and Trump condemned those. Do you feel that a nationwide mask mandate will be effective?
I think it's a good idea, but I'm not convinced that it's going to be widely followed. It seems to me that over the last 6-7 months, that because Trump did not impose any kind of nationwide standard and mandate for masks and discounted mask use himself, that that's the attitude that a lot of people, particularly his followers, tend to have. And so they tend to be pretty casual about interaction. I know on campus that there is a mask mandate for campus and social distancing requirement, but it seems to me that that has not been true, certainly in most locations around the country. And if you look in Clarksville, for example, the times that I have been out, which is very, very few, picking up groceries, for example, I've noticed that a lot of people are out without masks and don't social distance all that much. Driving downtown on Franklin Street, a restaurant, I noticed that people were standing together, talking without masks. And so I think it's going to be very hard, particularly there's not going to be much enforcement. I don't think we're going to have regular police officers going around giving fines for not wearing masks. There are not going to be any other mask police that are assigned to do it. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for it to take hold.
Dr. Kanervo, I want to ask, some Democrats argue President Trump is disinterested of the outcome of COVID-19. Some Republicans argue Trump has done everything he is supposed to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. What do you think?
Well, I think that he might have been able to act a little quicker than he did. If you go back and look at the interviews he had with Bob Woodward back in January, it appears based on that interview that Woodward talked about in his book, that in fact, it seems to me Trump was aware of the seriousness of the COVID-19. He knew about it fairly early in January, certainly by mid to late January, and yet the response from him, the shutdown of travel and the economy, really didn't occur very seriously until maybe early March. I remember traveling the end of January by air, and there was no mention or concern or discussion of it or any kind of standards or requirements to travel at that time. And so I think they probably could have and should have been imposed a little bit earlier than they were. If it had been isolated to those areas, I think there was a nursing home in Washington State, as I recall, and then some influx in New York. If we'd been able to limit it there, then that might have made a major difference.
So I want to make a shift now. I want to kind of shift things. So according to a recent BBC News article, Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris have launched a website for the transition of their office. And the team plans to focus on climate change, the economy, and tackling racism. Do you think Trump supporters are equally invested in tackling the topic of racism, such as Biden supporters?
I don't know that they are. Trump himself declined to admit that there is systemic racism. Biden did agree to that charge, that statement is true, that there is systemic racism. Certainly, I think Vice President-elect Harris believes that as well. Trump does not. And I don't know that many of his followers do. It seems to me that his followers tend to pretty much echo him right down the line in regard to beliefs, not only on racism, but climate change and these other topics as well. So unfortunately, I think there's going to be some hard work to do to impose and bring about changes that will end systemic racism, that will once and for all put racism behind us.
Why is it that you think that we see more racism now more than ever? Early this year, we had the occurrence of the George Floyd incident. And why do you think this year alone, consumers are fed up more now than they ever were before?
The George Floyd incident was so dramatic and obnoxious and unnecessary that it seemed to me that it really illustrated in a very unfortunate way the racism that does exist in this country. The fact that you'd have a police officer very openly kneeling on a person's neck for almost 10 minutes, cutting off air supply, not doing anything, despite the fact that Mr. Floyd said that he could not breathe. That was ignored by the police officer. That was just kind of almost an in-your-face sort of action, racist action. And I think that was the spark that set off so many people. And then, of course, we saw other actions later on, Breonna Taylor, others, shootings that took place. The one that bothered me as much as any, I think, was the incident in southern Georgia where the young African-American man was jogging in the neighborhood and was just kind of literally tracked down almost like an animal by the men in the truck and shot. So senseless and so unnecessary. I just don't understand that kind of behavior, frankly. So it's those kinds of incidences that I think, unfortunately, have sparked the kind of, finally, kind of push we've had that we've needed for 100 years to finally get racism and racial issues behind us so that everyone can be treated equally.
Okay, so the president and the vice president-elect, their website, buildbackbetter.com, tackles rebuilding the economy and racial disparities for healthcare for African-American communities. What impact do you feel the Biden campaign will have for people of color?
Well, I hope that, number one, I hope that the two candidates in the runoff in Georgia who are Democrats are elected so that there will be a Democratic controlled Senate. That is an important fact, I think, to occur in order for Biden and the Democratic Party to get through their package of programs. Otherwise, there's going to have to be compromises. They're going to be, which aren't necessarily a bad thing, but nevertheless, they're going to be blockages that are put in the way of Biden trying to get everything done that he would like to accomplish. I know, for example, that he would like to perhaps reinforce the civil rights legislation, particularly this Voting Rights Act of 1965. There was a portion of that declared unconstitutional and unnecessary, 4, 5, 6 years ago. And there have been moves to try to get part of that updated so that it would be appropriate for this time, and to try to get at the voter suppression, which has been alleged in states like Georgia and others around the South particularly. I think Biden's going to have, unfortunately, a difficult time, but that's not to say that he cannot make some progress at least. And of course, some progress is better than none. So I hope that there will be some progress made so that we can continually take steps to move racism behind us. It's just amazing to me that we're 160 years past the end of the Civil War, and that it's still a problem. It should have been handled, it seems to me, more directly in the 1800s than let it continue until 21st century.
So in a recent interview with White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows states, in Trump's defense, we are not going to control the pandemic. So going back to COVID-19, what would you say is the main reason for there being a delay in concern to control the pandemic?
They don't believe they can control it. They seem to not understand that it is a serious illness. They have not been, as we talked about earlier, willing to push the use of face masks. They have not been willing to have adequate testing so that people can be tested and isolated once they have discovered that they have COVID-19. We've seen the large number of cases that have occurred in and around the White House itself, with Mark Meadows, of course, one of the later ones to get it a couple of days ago. And so it's a matter of, it seems to me, the Trump administration just simply not taking COVID-19 terribly seriously and believing that they've got to let it go, let the economy come back as well as it can, and we'll deal with the illnesses and deaths later once we get a vaccine that we know is workable. So I'm afraid that's their strategy. Let people get it. Some are going to die. Too bad. And keep the economy going as well as we can so that people can be employed, make money for their families, and we'll deal with the after effects later when we get a successful vaccine.
Would you argue that now we're in the COVID-19 pandemic, would you argue the economy is currently in a V-shaped recovery or a K-shaped recovery? And for those who don't know what that is, V-shaped, when the economy contracts sharply but bounces back just as dramatically. And then for K-shape, when parts of the economy recover at different rates when charted together may diverge. So what would you say?
I think it's much closer to a K-shape than to a V-shape. I don't see certainly a lot of the segments of the economy bouncing back right away, particularly in I guess what I would call the travel industry, particularly in hospitality industry, hotels, motels, restaurants. There are still a lot of problems. And as the number of cases has continued to increase fairly dramatically over the last month, what we're seeing in some parts of the country are increasing attempts to roll back some of the progress we had made so that restaurants have to close earlier. Restaurants may not have as many patrons as perhaps they were having a week or two ago. So that there just is not the ability to move ahead in all sectors of the economy. There are some stores that have opened that are doing okay, I think. But unfortunately, not everybody. And it's going to be very difficult in those areas of the economy that are very customer, face-to-face customer reliant, like restaurants, hotels, motels.
Many argue the economy has skyrocketed since President Trump was elected into office, and others disagree and feel the economy has gotten worse. Do you feel the economy has seen substantial growth since President Trump has been in office? If so, how, and if not, why?
Well, there was growth during his first 3 years in office. It was a continuation, I think, to a great degree, of the growth that had begun under Obama and Biden in the comeback from the recession, the Great Recession in the 2008-2009 era. So we had a comeback, pretty steady comeback, beginning around 11-12, 2013. And it continued through 16, 17, 18. And then in early 2020, of course, January, February is when COVID hit. Now, there are those who would argue that the economy, as Trump would say, was the best ever during his first 3 years of office. I don't know that statistically we can show that. Certainly unemployment was low. Unemployment was down to 4.5%, which is quite good. It was down apparently for women, African Americans, Hispanics. Whether it was the lowest ever for them, I don't know, but it was somewhat lower for them. At the same time, though, there were segments of the economy which were not good. We know that there were people who were having to work 2 or 3 jobs to get through, to make payments on their homes, to buy food, medicine, take care of their kids. That because the basic salary scale of this country was not what it needed to be, particularly with the minimum wage workers. They were not making enough money to make it well in this country. And so unfortunately, there were a lot of people who were making it, but they were 1 or 2 paychecks away from financial disaster in their own families. And that's what's happened.
So in conclusion, do you think our nation will heal from the destruction that we are currently faced with? If so, do you think Biden has what it takes to heal our nation?
Well, I'm optimistic about Biden. I tend to like the issues that he has been promoting. The end of systemic racism, but also getting the economy going again, fighting COVID, which is necessary to get things back to normal. And I'm particularly interested in his fight on global warming, using the alternative energy sources such as solar and wind as ways not only of trying to fight climate change, but also to promote an economic renewal in this country, create jobs, great jobs, good paying jobs in those industries. We know that wind and solar now are cheaper than coal. They're cheaper than oil, cheaper than natural gas, and obviously, of course, less polluting. So there's lots to push those kinds of changes in our economy. And I think if Biden continues moving ahead with energy, with dedication he can get the votes behind him in Congress that he needs, that I'm pretty optimistic that we'll make progress. I don't think he's going to accomplish everything in 4 years and get everything done that he would like to get done in 4 years. But at the same time, I think we can make some good positive headway.
Well, Dr. David Kanervo, we thank you so much for your time. And for those viewing and watching, we thank you for your time. And all we can do is stay optimistic and stay positive for a better outcome. In closing, I'm Stephen Alexander.
And I'm Angela Peterson.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to redo that intro one more time because it was a hot mess. So I'm going to redo the intro one more time, and then Dr. Kanervo, you can leave.
That's fine.
I appreciate your time again, and thank you so much for spending your 30 minutes with us.
I'm happy to do it. Sometimes I feel when I retire that means people assume I'm dead. And so I'm happy to be invited back again.
No, you're very kind, and we appreciate the things that you had to say. Okay, so I'm gonna do that one more time.
So you're gonna stop the recording and then we're gonna do the intro again?
Yeah.